It's great to have you here on this beautiful evening. It feels almost guilty, doesn't it, to know how wonderful the weather is and how scary the weather looks in places like the Caribbean and South Florida. So I certainly say a prayer and hope that that area will not be too damaged. But this is our 11th program with the Trinity Forum and the wonderful collaboration we have with St. Paul Christian Academy. So I'm Brad Joy. I'm headmaster and teach English here, and it's been a privilege to be part of this with the Trinity Forum and with Jason Powell and St. Paul Christian Academy. This event affords an evening of good conversation around great ideas, and I'm particularly pleased to be talking about Dante tonight. I studied Dante several times in college and love the Inferno. And so these programs have been great opportunities for our schools and for the community. It's nice to see so many different individuals here and people return and new people come on these evenings, so I thank you for being here. I wanted to mention that we typically do 2 of these a year, but this year we will do a 3rd event, and the next speaker will be here in November. Cherie will tell you a little bit about David Brooks, who will be here in November, so we're looking forward to hosting that event. And I'm now very pleased to introduce Cherie, who's become a great friend to our schools and to the community. She does an exceptional job running the Trinity Forum. Thank you for being here as well. Please join me in welcoming Cherie.
Well, thank you, Brad, for that very gracious introduction. And I just want to add my welcome as well to all of you to tonight's evening conversation on how Dante can save your life. We've been, as Brad mentioned, just overjoyed really to be able to partner with both Brad and the Montgomery Bell Academy and with St. Paul Christian Academy and now with Jason Powell to be able to present an ongoing series of evening conversations on all manner of topics and issues. And this wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, and I want to thank them as well. We have our first corporate sponsor for this initiative, which we're really delighted by, the law firm of Sims Funk, and are pleased that Sam Funk could join us this evening. There are several foundations who've been generous sponsors of this effort as well, including the Beasley Family Foundation, the Cheris Foundation by Joe and Judy Cook, the Creed and Culture Fund, which is the family foundation of Byron and Bess Smith, and the Jonathan Edwards Center, as well as our individual sponsors and friends, Gary and Susan Dean, Nathan and Laura Green, Ed and Molly Powell, John and Carol Rochford, Marilyn Smith, and Giff and Anna Thornton. Just reflecting back on the different topics that we've covered over the past 5 years, it really has run the gamut. We started this initiative 5 years ago with Ron White, a Lincoln historian who spoke about Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. We've explored the question of whether freedom can last with sociologist Os Guinness. We've looked at the importance of beauty and imagination and poetry with California's poet laureate Dana Gioia. We've looked at whether science and God can mix with Oxford mathematician John Lennox, looked at the role of friendship in forming the imagination and in instilling courage with the examples of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien with our speaker Joe LaConte. Last time we heard from legal scholar John Anuzu on confident pluralism. And with this very broad range of topics, we have been delighted that every time we've had a full house, and once again we have sold out. And so when we sell out, we know that there are people who really wanted to be here but could not. So please spread the word that we are live streaming tonight's event. If you have friends who wanted to come and couldn't make it, send them a text now. They can join us by live streaming. We'll also be putting photos up on Facebook and recording this event, which will be on our website at www.ttf.org, as well as the websites of both St. Paul Christian Academy and the Montgomery Bell Academy. I see some new faces in the crowd, so for those of you who have not been here before, the Trinity Forum exists largely to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest question in the context of faith. And we believe that an essential part of wrestling with those great questions is consulting great works of literature and letters, or great books, who owe their greatness largely to their wisdom and insight in perceiving and illuminating the struggles and the longings of the human heart. who also show us the distortions, the flaws, the foibles of human nature, the joys and the suffering that pierce every human life, and the consequences of decisions. In short, they illustrate the human condition. And among the great books, there are few greater than the one we'll be discussing tonight. T.S. Eliot once wrote that Dante and Shakespeare divide the modern world between them. There is no third. But while Shakespeare's works are widely read, performed, even memorized, Dante's masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, an epic poem of over 800 pages, has proven a little bit more intimidating than popular, even among the most avid readers. But although it was written 7 centuries ago, The Divine Comedy tells us what could be a modern story of a man in a midlife crisis. Its central character is a middle-aged pilgrim who has lost his way in life. Oppressed by his own bad choices, perplexed by his own moral failures in the midst of good intentions, he finds himself alone in a dark wood, surrounded by danger. He undergoes a pilgrimage, first through the inferno, where the consequences of sin are fully realized, and then through purgatory, where the proclivity towards sin is expunged, before arriving at paradise. And along the way, both pilgrim and reader are plunged into a deeper understanding of the dark recesses of their own heart and even the dangers to their own soul. The literary power of the Divine Comedy lies not only in its beauty and poetic mastery, but also in its insights and wisdom. And in the words of our speaker tonight, it will not only inspire admiration, even reflection, but could, just possibly, save your life. It is a remarkable claim to make, and there are few who has made this claim with more elegance, literary skill, insight, or verve than our speaker tonight, Rod Dreher. Rod is a best-selling author, the senior editor of the American Conservative, and a staggeringly prolific writer and blogger whose articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, First Things, Touchstone, the LA Times, the Weekly Standard, and many others. He blogs not only seemingly incessantly at the American Conservative, but also at BeliefNet, and has appeared on NPR's All Things Considered with great regularity, as well as BBC Radio. He is also an author, the author of the colorfully, if not concisely titled, Crunchy Cons: How Birkenstocked Burkeans, Gun-Loving Organic Farmers, Evangelical Free Rangers, Hip Homeschooling Mamas, Right-wing nature lovers, and their diverse tribe of countercultural conservatives plan to save America, or at least the Republican Party. As well as The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, written about his sister, and his latest work, The Benedict Option, a strategy for Christians in the post-Christian world, hit number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list, and was labeled by our next speaker, David Brooks, as, quote, already the most discussed and important religious book of the decade. But it is his work, How Dante Can Save Your Life, the life-changing wisdom of history's greatest poem, that is his own favorite work, and one that we think you will particularly enjoy and find both inspiring and instructive. Rod, welcome.
Thank you. Well, you know, I was thinking as listening to Cherie talk about Dante and how majestic he is and how he's one of the all-time greats, but I couldn't help recall a conversation I just had at the reception with a new friend who shall remain nameless. I know he's in this room. We were talking about, we had a tender moment about a shared passion of our childhood for hee-haw, which was set here in Nashville, and what a great thing it is for me to come here to the home of hee-haw in Nashville. But I told him, I said, you know, I bet this is probably the only time anybody has sat here in Montgomery Bell Academy and talked about Buck Owens and Roy Clark and where, oh, where are you tonight? So this is where I am tonight, and thank you all so much for coming out. Now, I wrote a book about Dante, but I'm not a scholar at all. I'm a journalist. I have an undergraduate degree in journalism and political science from LSU. I'm the last person you would have expected to write a book about Dante. And I'm not a guy who loves poetry. I read constantly, but I rarely read fiction. For me, it's usually theology, philosophy, history, politics, and so on, not poetry. But in the depths of the worst emotional and physical crisis of my life, I stumbled headlong into Dante's Divine Comedy, a 3-volume Italian poem from the 14th century. And miracle of miracles, it saved my life. I'm going to tell that story tonight. There really are hardly two people who are less alike than Dante Alighieri and me. I'm from a little town called St. Francisville on the Mississippi River in South Louisiana. Dante Alighieri was one of the great men of his era in Florence, Italy, in the 13th and 14th century. Dante, at a young age, became already a famous poet in Tuscany and beyond. And as he got a little bit older, he was involved with the elites, the ruling elites of Florence, which at that time is one of the richest and most powerful cities in Europe. And even in 1302, he was, in the middle of his life, he was one of the governors, one of the priors of the city. But he got mixed up in politics. Politics was cutthroat back then, even more, believe it or not, than it is here today. And the Pope, and Dante was a very devout Catholic, Pope Boniface VIII lured Dante out of Florence on a diplomatic mission. While Dante was away, there was a military coup, or not a military coup, a political coup by his political enemies. They tried Dante in absentia, sentenced him to exile, and he knew that if he went back to the city, they were going to kill him. So he never saw Florence again. He lost his city, which was enormous for a man of the Middle Ages. He lost his fortune, he lost his family, he lost everything. And to top it all off, the Pope of the faith he treasured had been one of the chief agents of his downfall. Well, Dante, he spent the rest of his life in exile, the next 20 years or so, and he was trying to figure out what happened to him. Everything was going right. He had done everything right in his society to succeed, and he had been at the top, and then virtually overnight, it had all disappeared. He tried to figure out what was the reason behind this. What had he done wrong? What had gone wrong? The answer is the Divine Comedy, this poem in 3 books, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, 14,233 lines, some of the most beautiful verse ever composed by a human being. And I had never read it. We didn't have it in my high school, we didn't have it in college. I hardly knew what it was. I knew it was one of those great books that you were supposed to have read, but of course I never read it. What brought me to the Divine Comedy was a very strange set of circumstances. As I said, I was born and raised in a small town, South Louisiana, to a very traditional Southern family. I was the oldest child and the only son. And if you are from the South and you have a daddy like mine, you know that there's a lot put on your shoulders if you are the namesake. I wanted to please him so badly, but I just couldn't do it. I was a bad hunter. My heart wasn't in it. I couldn't hunt. I couldn't do sports. I was an egghead. I had my head in a book all the time. My dad was one of the smartest men I've ever known, but he was a man of action. He was always outside building something or hunting or fishing or he was a countryman. He was the genius of West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, and I wasn't. And I felt really displaced from that. My younger sister, Ruthie, 2 years younger than I, she was the son my dad never had. She loved hunting, she loved sports, and she was good at it. She loved country living. She loved country music, which I never learned to love. I know I'm in Nashville here, but I'm going to confess that to you right now because I'm a humble man. So when I got out of college, went to LSU, and I ended up on the East Coast working as a journalist, and I thought I'd never go back because I really wasn't, I loved my home, but it wasn't a place for me. My sister went to LSU. When she graduated, she moved home to teach in a local school, married her high school sweetheart, built a house right across the yard from Mom and Daddy, and that was her life. She started her family. I started my family, and that was how it was with us. I'd go down to visit them every 2 or 3 times a year, and when we had kids, we'd bring them down, and that was nice. Yet in my professional work as a journalist and as an author of books, I really felt strongly that we were rootless in our country, and that I was a guy who moved around from place to place to place, chasing jobs, chasing the next job up, and I could feel the hole in my own heart, and it wasn't just me. I could see there was something wrong with our country, this loss of roots, and I wrote about it and longed to go back home, but I didn't see that as a possibility. Well, in 2010, just before, right after my wife and I and our kids moved from Dallas to Philadelphia back to the East Coast, my sister started coughing, and she couldn't figure out what it was. By the time they figured out that it was lung cancer, it was too late for her, stage 4. She had never smoked a day in her life. 3 kids, she was a golden girl. She had done everything right, and then she was dying. It was completely shocking to the whole town, and certainly to me living far away, and I wanted to be close to home to help her out. I was able, over the course of the 19 months in which she lived, I was able to get down there a fair amount, and I saw something that completely changed the way I viewed small-town life. I saw my sister, who was a good girl. I knew that. She was a good teacher. People loved her. But she was really heroic. She had such a grandeur, a spiritual grandeur about her that really came out when suddenly her life was on the line. And this little town that I couldn't wait to get out of because it was confining me, it turned out to be a place filled with grace and filled with love. And they came and helped my sister and her kids and her husband and my mom and dad, and they carried her to her death. It was a beautiful thing, and when we went down from Philly for the funeral in 2011, my wife and I had a real epiphany. We said, we're called to be here. We need to be there. We need these kind of roots, and we need to be there to help the family. So we moved down. We went back to Philly, got our affairs in order, and moved down in Christmas of 2011. I really thought I was giving my dad everything he wanted. You know, he wanted his son and his grandkids back home, and I thought finally, after all this long circle I'd made professionally out in the world, I was coming home. And I could do it because I was a writer and could live anywhere. And I thought that my sister's kids would welcome us back, but it didn't happen, and I couldn't figure it out. They were very distant. We were there 2 or 3 months, and I ended up taking my niece Hannah, my sister's oldest child, who was 19. She was having the toughest time dealing with her mother's death. I took her to Paris. I had a little bit of money that spring, and I had always promised her, if Uncle Rod ever gets any money, he'll take you to Paris. Because I had been trained by my elderly aunts who had been Red Cross nurses in World War I to love Paris and to love France, and I'd really come to love it. And you can imagine how that sat with my dad. So I took Hannah for Easter 2012. We went to Paris, and we had a great time. But on our last night there in the city, we had a nice dinner. We were walking down the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and she said, Uncle Rod, I have to tell you something. What, sweetie? You're not going to make it at home. My sisters are not going to accept you. I'm like, what are you talking about? And she said, Mama, my sainted sister Ruthie, and Pawpaw, my dad, they raised us to think you were bad because you left home and you went to the big city, got above yourself, that sort of thing. It's a familiar story I heard a lot in Washington from kids who had come from small towns like I had. And Hannah said, I know that they're wrong about it, but I didn't know this until I got to be a little bit older, 15, 16, and started coming to visit y'all. But my sisters don't have this experience, and they're not going to let you in. I thought my world was over then. I collapsed. Internally, I collapsed. I said I'd brought my family back home chasing this dream, and it turns out it was a lie. My family had never been mean to me. We were a very Southern family. We were very polite, and there was always harmony. We always took a good picture, but this was the secret. This was the dark secret. Well, when I got back home, I realized that I thought I was completing a circle coming home, but in fact, I'd stepped off a cliff. I got very depressed. I became physically quite ill with the basically chronic mononucleosis. And I could hardly get out of bed some days. I went to see a rheumatologist. They tested me, and he said, we can't find any reason why you have this, so we think it's chronic anxiety and stress. What do you have to be stressed over? And I told him that the thing I dreamed of all my life, I'd come home to give my dad everything he wanted, seeking his approval, and they rejected me, and it's not going to be possible to come home. Well, the doctor said, you got to get out of here, or you're not going to make it. I said, well, we can't leave. I can't drag my wife and kids out again. And, you know, my mom and dad, they can be difficult, but they're good people, and I need to be here for them. I'm the only child they have left. The doctor said, you better find peace some kind of way, or you're not going to make it. Well, my wife forced me at that time, because she's the one with common sense in our family. She forced me to go see a therapist against my will. But the real therapist was Dante. Turns out, around this time, I was in the bookstore in Baton Rouge, a Barnes & Noble, just in the poetry section. Why, I'm not really sure, because again, I don't like poetry. But there I was. And there on the top shelf was a Divine Comedy of Dante Alighieri. And I thought, you know, I like to think of myself as the kind of guy who would have read great books if only they had been presented to him. But it didn't occur to me that I could actually read them now. And so I said, you know, too bad I missed that, but I can't climb this literary Mount Everest at my age. I was 45, 46. But I pulled it off the shelf anyway, and I started reading the first few lines. In the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the straight path. And I thought, this is me. It hit me like a bomb right there in the bookstore. I said, I'm in the middle of the journey of my life, and I'm lost. I thought I was coming home. My life made so much sense, and then suddenly, with that revelation on the street in Paris, everything fell apart. Well, it's kind of scary. I put the book back on the shelf, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A couple of weeks later, I bought the book, The Divine Comedy, and began to read it. And I did not read it like a disinterested scholar, or I didn't read it for entertainment or edification. I read it as if I had been shipwrecked on a beach and had seen a message in a bottle, and the message was the Divine Comedy, and I was looking at a map that would get me out of the dark wood I was in. Well, the structure of the comedy, I should say a little bit about it. The whole story is a journey from brokenness to wholeness. Dante the poet told his patron in a letter that he intended his whole work to be something that can take people from a state of misery to a state of happiness. And that's what happened to me. The book is in 3 parts. The first one, which is the one most people know, is the Inferno. It's part of where Dante the Pilgrim, there's a character in the poem called Dante. Dante the Pilgrim goes with Virgil into the depths of hell. And this is where he learns what sin is and what his own sin is. The second part is Purgatorio, in which he comes out of hell and is granted the road to heaven by the grace of God, and goes up the holy mountain, being purged of his tendency to sin. He's been forgiven in Catholic theology. He's been forgiven by the grace of God, but he has to get rid of this tendency to sin before he can be granted paradise. And in the third book, Paradiso, he finds out what it means to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he becomes filled as he goes closer and closer to the throne of God with divine grace and light. Well, it shouldn't surprise you that Dante was a committed Christian, as am I, but you don't have to be a believer to learn from Dante. His message is eternal, and that's why we still read it today. It's universal. It is taught everywhere, not taught enough, but it's taught and loved still to this day because Dante saw the human heart, and he knew what human brokenness was, and he knew what it meant to be delivered. At the time I was reading Dante, as I said earlier, I was working with a therapist, and with my priest. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. I was working with my priest, and they helped me. But Dante was my real therapist. Dante was the real spiritual leader who took me out through the darkness of my own heart and out again. And I would go to confession sometimes, or I would go sit with my therapist, and I would start by saying, all right, I was reading the Divine Comedy this week, and this is what happened. And my therapist and my priest got used to this because neither one had read the book, but they could see that something powerful was happening in me, a powerful work of repentance was happening in me from this book. One of the amazing things I learned about this book, from this book, was to think of sin as disordered love. I had always thought of sin as like breaking the rules, and in a sense it is. But Dante, taking it from Augustine, conceived of sin as loving the wrong things or loving the right things in the wrong way, either too much or too little. And that was really helpful for me because it was not wrong to love your family. It was not wrong to love your place and your people and your tradition. But why had it brought me so much unhappiness? When Dante goes down into the Inferno and sees the different sinners who were there, he discovers that they're all there because they chose a certain passion over God. They loved in the wrong way. Well, I had never thought about it like that. I came to see that through Dante's eyes that there's a difference between an icon and an idol. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the icons that you're all familiar with, those are seen as windows into the divine, a matter through which God mediates his love and his truth, or some aspect of transcendent reality. An idol is an icon that is taken as an ultimate end, as the thing we worship. Dante had made a great mistake in his life, as he learned. He had made love, passionate love, romantic love, and especially as it was incarnated in Beatrice, his true love, he had made that the goal of his life and not God, and that was where he made his crucial mistake. There were other mistakes he made too, but he had gotten off the straight path by making power, maybe, and status, and poetry, and above all, Beatrice and romantic love, his gods. Well, in my case, that wasn't true for me, so what had I made an idol of? I found out in the Inferno when I got to one of the circles where the heretics are, and in this particular particular canto, Dante and Virgil are walking through a graveyard. The graveyard is full of open graves with fire coming out of them, and these are where the people who had not believed in the afterlife were spending the afterlife. They had thought that the world was all that was there, but in fact, they were wrong, and this is where they were going to be for eternity. Well, in the poem, as Dante the Pilgrim and Virgil are walking by this one grave, out of the fire and out of the pit arises this man. He is a grandee, a Florentine grandee called Farinata. And he had really lived in real life in the middle of the 13th century, in the previous generation to Dante. He had been a great general and politician of the Ghibelline faction, which were the enemies of Dante's faction. And Farinata had been so proud of his family. He had been proud of Florence, his city, and what they stood for, but he thought they were everything. And there he was in the grave. He was sharing a grave with one of his neighbors and a guy who had married into his family who had felt the same way. But these are people who had brought the city to ruin because of their rivalries and their pride, because they thought they had it all. Well, Farinata calls to Dante. He says, "I hear the voice of a Tuscan. Come closer and let me see if you're worth talking to." Well, that reminded me of growing up in the Deep South, some of the very haughty people you can find in some of these old families in New Orleans and elsewhere who don't talk to people who are beneath them. This was Farinata. So Dante the Pilgrim goes there, and they start talking politics, and then they start trash-talking each other, and it's very entertaining. But after a while, you realize, wait, why is Farinata doing this? Here comes a man from the real world, from the realm of the living, and he's from his own city. And all he wants to do is talk about the old days and why this young man has failed. And all Dante wants to do, the Pilgrim Dante, is argue with this old man who's in hell. And suddenly it hit me. This is me and my dad. My dad had placed family and duty and loyalty in a very Southern way. That was the most important thing to him. And I had failed him because I had failed to value it as he had. And we were stuck arguing for most of my adult life over this. I couldn't control my dad, but I could control myself. And I realized I can walk away from this. I can move on. And Dante the Pilgrim needs to move on too. Very soon after that, Dante the Pilgrim goes into a forest where the suicides are spending their lives, their afterlife. And he ends up talking to this guy who had been a servant to the Holy Roman Emperor. And he had fallen out of favor. Piero della Vigna was his name. He had fallen out of favor with the Holy Roman Emperor and had killed himself because he could not live without the approval of this man, the Holy Roman Emperor, from whom he took his entire status. That was me and my dad, too, I realized. I felt that I wasn't worthwhile because I didn't have his approval. I knew he loved me because he was my father and he was very affectionate, but I also knew he didn't approve of me. And I was killing myself physically because I couldn't accept that. Having had these things pointed out to me, I went to my priest and said, you know what, I have to tell you, in confession, I'm an idol worshiper. He said, wait, what? I said, seriously, I have made an idol of family and place and tradition and of my dad, and it has really taken me off in the wrong path, and I want to repent of that. So he heard my confession, and that was that. Believe it or not, though, things began to change. I could feel something had loosened its grip on me, and for the first time in my life, my adult life, I believed that God loved me because I'd confused God the Father with my Father. But that's not where it stopped, not remotely. I was so angry at injustice. That has characterized my career. I ended up losing my Catholic faith because I fought so hard as a journalist to write about the abuse scandal and just to right these wrongs. And I let the anger I had at that injustice consume me and my faith. It was a great mistake. It was a loving justice too much. But there I was back in Louisiana, angry at my mom and my dad and my family for not accepting me back. This is unjust. Well, following Dante on his pilgrimage into the Purgatorio, he gets to the terrace of wrath where the tendency to be angry is purged. And on this terrace, it's covered with smoke. There's like black choking smoke around and sparks. This is what anger does. It makes us blind. Dante begins to talk to a man named Marco, who's there being purged. He says, Marco, I come from a world back in Tuscany where it's city against city. Families are tearing each other apart. The church is corrupt. The state is corrupt. Give me some wisdom I can take back and help my people. Marco says, brother, the world is blind, and you come from it too. Now, Marco goes on to say that people think that we're fated to live this way, and yeah, there are certain things that we can't change, but God gives us free will. We can change our own hearts, and if we refuse evil and choose good, and we keep doing it, things will slowly begin to change. And Marco ends by saying, if you seek what's wrong in the world, he's pointing to Dante, look inside your own heart. And that really hit me, because this is what my therapists and my priests have been trying to tell me all along, but I couldn't hear them. I had all my defenses up, but Dante pierced those defenses. He subverted my defenses, and he convicted me. If you want a world of peace and order and virtue, said Dante, then conquer your own rebel heart. Quit blaming others for problems in your life and take responsibility for yourself and your own restoration. God is there to help you reach your better nature, but because you are free, the decision is in your hands. That was so empowering to me, but I knew that I had to be the one to exercise my own free will and refuse that anger. That prison cell was locked from the inside. My priest kept telling me, Rod, you cannot hold on to that anger. You don't have that right as a Christian to be so angry. It's not that your parents haven't done you wrong, but you've got to love them anyway, as Christ loved you. And I knew he was right. And he'd tell me, anything holding you back from loving is sin. You're not loving properly. You're not loving as God wants you to love them. Oh, it was so difficult for me because I felt like they were winning. If I love them, they're going to win. A priest said, it doesn't look like you're winning very much. Later in the Paradiso, in the heaven part, Dante comes upon a nun called Picarda. She had really lived in real life in Tuscany. And she is, for a particular reason, on the lowest level of heaven. And Dante the Pilgrim says, that doesn't seem quite right to me. What happened to you? It's not your own fault. Why is God putting you down here? And she says to him, you don't understand, son, not one bit. She goes, and this is a quote, brother, the power of love subdues our will so that we long for only what we have and thirst for nothing else. What she was telling Dante is these distinctions don't really matter here in the kingdom of love. We're just happy. I'm so happy to be here that that's all I want. This is where God had assigned her, she said, and if she wanted something more, well, then her will would be discordant with God's. To be ruled by love, said Picarda, is to be in perfect harmony with the divine will. Picarda then utters one of the most famous lines in the whole poem, and in his will is our peace. In other words, to dwell in perfect love is to desire nothing but to please God. Don't begrudge others what they have. Be grateful for what you have. And as my priest, Father Matthew, told me, God wills you to find some way in your brokenness to love your parents as he loves you, even if they don't fully love you back in the way you want. If I was ever going to be free of my sickness and my depression, I had to do that. Well, I worked on it. I spent months working on it. It was really, really hard because I didn't feel it in my heart, but I still had to do the act, continuing to help take care of my parents. I did my dad's medicine because he was old and he was sick and he was dying. But the more I did that, the more I forced myself to perform acts of love, the easier it became to do, just like Marco had told Dante. And my parents didn't suddenly become angelic. Nothing changed with them, but the change was happening in me. And I could love them as fellow broken pilgrims on this journey through life. I no longer dwelled on the injustice and the anger, but I tried to love my dad with all he had because I could tell he had maybe a year left. Well, you get to the spring of 2016, and Daddy is pretty much coming close to the end. He calls me on Holy Thursday of that year. I lived about a mile from him out in the country. He said, I need you to take me to the barbershop. All right. I took him across Thompson Creek to the next town over to his barber, and he was on his walker getting in there, moving very slowly. On the way back home, he said, you know, son, I feel like I'm taking the final round around the bend. I said, yep, probably so. Is there anything I can do to help you? Can I call somebody for you that you've known in your life and maybe somebody you need to ask forgiveness of? He said, well, no, I never did anything wrong. I don't need to be forgiven. And I was looking at my dad, who was, again, one of the smartest people I've ever met. And here he was saying, 81 years old, that he had never sinned. I said, Daddy, he wasn't much of a churchgoer, but I said, Daddy, you know what the Bible says. And besides, you were not always right to Mama. Wasn't fair. That was an understatement. And you weren't always kind to me either. And he said, well, son, the reason I did those things, and he was justifying himself because he had that sin of pride. He was Farinata. Then I felt really guilty. I said, why did I put this on this poor old man now, bringing that up again? I'd put that aside. I apologized and took him home, helped him get back to the house, and that was that. The next morning, Good Friday, I went over to do his pill bottles again for him. And there he was sitting on his front porch in his rocking chair, reading the paper, drinking his coffee. And we were a very affectionate family, so I kissed him on the cheek and wished him good morning in his chair. And I ran in and did his pills. And I came out, and I was going to tell him I couldn't stay. I had work to do that day. And I leaned over to kiss him on the cheek, and he grabbed me by the arm. And I looked at him, and his eyes were welling with tears. And again, this is not a sentimental man, and this is not a particularly prayerful man. But he looked up at me, and his chin was quivering, and he said, I talked to the Lord last night for a long time about my transgressions against you. That was the word he used, transgressions. And I told him I was sorry, and I think he forgave me. And he looks up at me, and I realized this was a moment like in A Brideshead Revisited when Lord Marchmain is on his deathbed, and all he can do to signal his repentance is make the sign of the cross. This was that moment in my dad's life, and I'd been there to hear it. I just kissed him on the cheek and embraced him and thanked him and went on my way. But on the way home, back to my house, I reflected on how if I had known what was waiting me back in Louisiana, I never would have gone back there. That journey through the inferno, through sickness, through the caverns of my own heart and having to fight those dragons. But if I had not done that and gone on that journey and learned how to love my dad despite the brokenness, I would never have been there on that Good Friday morning, 2015, to hear him say, son, I'm sorry. I waited all my adult life to hear that, and there it was, that gift. I realized that I could not have been healed also except through the power of story. I'm not a stupid person, but nonfiction was not doing it for me. I could have read every single lesson I learned in Dante in a book of self-help or any number of things, of psychology, and all my defenses were up. It took story to do it, to call me out of myself and to go on this imaginative journey with Dante, which is really a journey into my own dark heart and out into the light. There are lots of lessons that we can learn from Dante, but I got to tell you before I get to that, I want to tell you how this story ended. That summer, my dad went into home hospice care, and he went down pretty fast. They brought a hospital bed to his bedroom, And one morning my mom calls me and says, get over here. He's on the couch. He wants to go back to his bed, and I can't lift him. So I got over there. We lifted my dad. We got him into his hospital bed, and he never left it until the undertaker came 8 or 9 days later. But I moved in that day with him. My mom was exhausted from caring for him, and I said, you go in the guest bedroom. I'll sleep in y'all's bed, and I'll be here to take care of him throughout the night. And I spent every day, every minute of every day I could with my dad in his room. We never had a big conversation, but I prayed over him and with him. I read him the Psalms. I read him stories. Pro tip, Flannery O'Connor is not what you should read a dying man. I sat with him as he watched. He had at the foot of his bed a TV that I'd bought him because, you know, if you're going to spend the last week of your life on earth, you don't want to miss a moment of Bill O'Reilly, and Daddy didn't want to. So I watched Bill O'Reilly with him, and I would rub lotion into his feet and his legs, and it was just a beautiful thing, a healing thing. And there was so much grace that passed between us. Not a word was said of that, but everything was said. And on the day he could tell he was dying, we called the family around and the neighbors, his lifelong friends, and everybody was standing there. I was holding his hand, one hand, and my mom was holding the other when he breathed his last. And I had always, all my adult life, feared that day. I told my wife when we got married, I said, I just want you to know what you're marrying into. The day my dad dies, I'm going to be like Wile E. Coyote when he runs off the cliff before he realizes that he's about to fall. That look that he gets in his face of like there's nothing under me and there's a long fall below, that's going to be me. And there we were in the moment. I was there. And I felt nothing but peace. I couldn't figure it out. And harmony, like this is what needs to be. And of course the undertaker came and the neighbors came and the family came to mourn. And I went back to my own house that night for the first time in 8 or 9 days. And I was standing in the kitchen thinking, what just happened? Did that really, this day that I've been dreading, was it really, did it turn out to be a blessing? How did that happen? And suddenly I remembered Dante. And I remembered the words of Picarda, in his will is our peace. And because I had willed to get out of myself and to try to love, no matter how hard it was, I had been given the grace of being there when my dad died and holding his hand, and everything was at peace between us. That was the first and only time I've cried over my dad's death, but they were tears of gratitude for what God gave me through the Divine Comedy. I think there are lots of lessons we can all learn individually from Dante from reading this poem, but I think these are especially pertinent to our public life today. We have to realize that our life is exile. This is not our home. Things aren't right, but this is the human condition. How do we deal with it? That is the test. Secondly, if we put love of anything above love of God and neighbor, then we make idols. And those idols are going to destroy us and destroy other things around us too. Whether it's we make politics, the pursuit of business, power, the church can be an idol too. Anything that we prefer to the love of God is an idol, and it's wrong. There is no humanity also without humility. At the beginning of the Purgatorio, before Dante begins to crawl out of the pit, he has to gird his loin with a reed to represent humility. And this is the poet's way of saying, if you are going to make any spiritual progress in this world into healing what's broken, you have got to be humble. You've got to humble yourself and admit that you are broken and you need forgiveness and you need to give forgiveness to other people. Anger blinds us. I mean, my gosh, you turn on the TV now and you see what anger does to us. Anger makes us so self-righteous. I was so self-righteous about my parents. I was so self-righteous about the Catholic Church as a Catholic. It wasn't that they had done the right thing. They had done the wrong thing. But that anger, which I perceived as virtue, because if I'm not angry, the bad guys win, that was destroying me. It's right to pursue justice, but not at the expense of love. Perfect justice, in God's eyes, is perfect love. And we're never going to know perfect justice in this world, but all we know that we have to do is to love no matter what. And we don't find peace by denying our desires. We do have to deny our desires when they're disordered, but unlike the Buddhism teaches that you find peace by denying your desires. But the faith Dante had and the faith I have says that no, desires are not bad in and of themselves. You've just got to rightly order them. And finally, adversity could be the thing that saves our lives. Dante became a great poet and saved his soul by returning to God because he was dispossessed. He lost all his power. He lost his status. He lost his family and his fortune. He had nothing, and he was able to see himself as he really was, and that forced him to come to terms with himself and his own brokenness. And it became the thing that made him as a poet. We read him today because of the poem he wrote out of his brokenness. He created a thing of great depth and beauty, a thing that healed people, has healed people for centuries, and that healed me, a numbskull living in South Louisiana in the 21st century. I was able to take this poem, this letter he wrote, and message in a bottle that came across 7 centuries to me and heal me, just like Dante wanted it to do to his readers. I got his suffering, his brokenness, his loss was the making of Dante, and it was the making of me, because I got my life back. I got my dad back. I got God back. I was finally able to accept that I was a beloved son of God. And I was able to die, to let my dad go, and him able to let me go in peace and harmony. Again, like I said earlier, if I had known what I was going to get when I was headed back to Louisiana, I never would have gone. But thank God for that brokenness. Thank God for that suffering. None of us are ever going to escape suffering. It's how we deal with it that gives it meaning and makes all the difference in the world. Thank you for listening to my story, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you, Rod. On behalf of St. Paul Christian Academy, I want to thank Montgomery Bell Academy, also the Trinity Forum. Wonderful evening, wonderful comments. One of the roles I have on an evening like this is to ask the first question, Rod. While our guests come forward, we have microphones placed at the end of each aisle. I was sitting there trying to formulate a question, and I got lost in your story.
Make it about Junior Samples.
But thinking, to quote you, I think you said during those last few days with your father, you said nothing and you said everything. Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing that with each of us tonight and reminding us about the first order love. And as a believer, I think we all make that struggle of disorder in our lives, regardless of what we do when we serve. A question I did think as I was listening is, and you touched on it a little bit, the power of story. We think of Christ and the parables that he shared. You had access to a priest, your spiritual leader. You had access to a therapist. You were around a wife and family. What was it about Dante and the story that was maybe the bridge for you?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, as I indicated in my talk, I think that Dante flew below radar. I didn't see him coming. But as I was researching the book I wrote, How Dante Can Save Your Life, I discovered that neuroscientists have studied this, the power of story, and they found, they took 2 test groups. One, they hooked up electrodes to their brains, and they handed one group a nonfiction essay that made certain moral points or a certain argument. They handed the second group a story, a short story, that had the same lessons and same messages, and they compared the two. It turns out that the ones who had received it in story form, in fiction form, remembered a lot more about it. And they also discovered that when they were, the story group was reading about certain actions being taken in the story, the part of their brain that lights up when they actually do these things also lit up. In other words, when Dante was climbing up that mountain over those rocks, in my brain, I later discovered, the part that would have lit up had I been going over a rock also happened within me. And so I think that entering imaginatively into this story, it's why Christ taught in parables. There's something about a story that activates the imagination and the empathy in a way that can be transformative. But I don't think I had ever given myself over to a work of fiction like I did this, in the sense of just totally surrendering and not trying to stand back and be critical, because that's my nature. I'm always wanting to stand back and find out what's wrong or how is this thing working. I was so desperate because of my illness and because of this hole I was in. I was just ready to follow. In the beginning, in the first 3 cantos of the Inferno, Virgil, the great poet of antiquity, comes to the pilgrim Dante, who's trapped in the dark wood and doesn't know how to get out. And Virgil says, "I've been sent by heaven. Follow me if you want to live." The pilgrim Dante doesn't say, "Now wait a minute, tell me where we're going, tell me how we're going to do this, or why should I trust you?" No, he just says, "Okay, I'll do it because I want to live." And that's what it was in me, that willingness to surrender, to just to fall back into the arms of this author whom I knew nothing about, made all the difference in the world. There was no defensiveness there. There was just willingness to accept a cup of cold water from this Good Samaritan. Yes, Father.
Well, I'd like to begin with a word of thanks. I'm not sure if you understand what kind of impact your book had on those of us who are engaged in ordained ministry. You did just inespable work in bringing out the pastoral import of a great work of literature, one that did lie on the shelf too long. And so your words, your insights have made a profound difference to me, my brother priest, and the way we care for others. So I'd like to really thank you for that.
Thank you. Glory to God. Thank you for that.
I've been struck by something I read years and years ago in von Balthasar's work on Dante, in it was the 3rd volume of his Glory of the Lord. And he's very complimentary of Dante. I mean, he thinks he's almost nearly revelatory. But he has this critique that I've never known what to do with, and I would be interested in your insights. He said that his vision of the Inferno is insufficiently Christian, that it's largely taken over from pagan antiquity, that it's a vision of hell that doesn't know the cross. It's a vision of hell that doesn't know that Christ ever descended there. And that's critique is always, I've never quite known what to do with that. I'm not sure if I believe that, but nevertheless, it's kind of stuck with me. So I'd like your response to that.
Yeah, I knew from the beginning that the Inferno was a poem. It was not theology. It was a poem informed by theology, but this is not the Bible. It's not Holy Scripture. And I guess I didn't really think about it in that way when I was reading it. I took it as a description of how sin works, because you notice when you go through purgatory that every single person the pilgrim Dante encounters, they're all alone, basically. They're by themselves. Their sin has isolated them for all eternity. And then when they go into the purgatorio, that's when community begins to be rebuilt. They all know they're forgiven sinners. They've been shown great mercy, and they help each other. They want to encourage each other and help each other carry that burden. And I took the Inferno as a vision of the hell we make for ourselves. You know, at the beginning of the Inferno, Dante learns that everybody who is sentenced to the Inferno, they go in there because they know that they deserve it, that this is just, this is what justice is. And I don't know how hell works in reality. I believe in hell, and I also believe in God's mercy. But for me, reading the Inferno taught me that if I want to be able to experience the mercy of God and eternal beatitude with Him, then I need to die to myself and not become a martyr to my own selfishness and my own sins. And this is a struggle that happens every day of one's life. So that's really interesting. After this is over, can you tell me where you got that in Balthasar? I want to read more about that.
So there are nearly as many books about Dante as there are translations, mostly bad. But your book is unusual in that not only is it about Dante and a great introduction to Dante that I've recommended a number of people look into, but it's also a confessional autobiography and a family history. And as I was reading your book, I was really struck by the degree of frankness and candor that you reveal to the reader, not just with your own personal thoughts and struggles, but even those of your family, living and dead. And I'm really curious as to your thoughts as an author and an editor of your own work. In constructing this, how did you aim for honesty and candor while at the same time navigating the Scylla and Charybdis of kind of personal indulgence,
Right.
or inconsiderate revelation of issues that perhaps should have been kept best in the family?
Boy, that's such a great question, and it's something I did struggle with when I wrote this. I reread How Dante Could Save Your Life to prepare for this talk for the first time since it came out in 2015. And I got to confess, I was like, I winced at some of it because it was so raw. And, but I also had to keep in mind, and I tried to be honest in the book about the failings of those around me, but also myself, and to try to stay focused on myself while being honest about my family, because the reason we were in so much trouble as a family is because nobody could be honest about who we were and what we had done wrong, and nobody could humble themselves enough to say, I'm sorry, please forgive me. And it was so important to me to write as truthfully as I could. While, I mean, there were things, of course, I didn't tell in that book, but to write as truthfully as I could, and also be merciful, but also truthful. And I knew that, you know, I don't think anybody in the family has read it because this was Dante, and but I would be willing to defend it. I'd be willing to defend it if maybe my mom read it, and I know she wouldn't like that because she wants to believe that we're one big happy family. But there's a point in the Paradiso where Dante meets, you know, imaginatively meets an ancestor, Cacciaguida, who tells him that you're going to go back and you're going to be exiled. I mean, because this happens before his exile, I think. But you're going to write words that will cause pain in the stomach of those who take them, but it will ultimately be for their health. And that's the spirit in which I tried to write this. But in order to tell the story truthfully, I needed to be as honest as I could. And the previous book, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming, of which this is a sequel, I had written about imperfections in the family, but I let everybody in the family who was a main character read it before I turned the manuscript in, and I said, if there's something in here I shouldn't say, that I got wrong, or you don't want me to say, I'll take it out. Nobody asked for anything to be taken out, and in fact, my dad, to whom I pay great tribute in the book, but I also talk about his imperfections, he was the one I was worried about. When he finished it, he called me, and I was like, oh, here it comes. He said, son, you told it like it was. And that's about as good a compliment as you can hope for. So did I get it right in How Dante? I don't know, but I knew that it was a confession. And what I hope happens, though, to the readers, that they'll see the great good in my family, because most anything that's good in me, it comes from my dad and mom and my family. And that's what made it so painful, the whole thing, is because these aren't bad people at all. These are some of the best people in the world. And yet, this is how we are with each other. We do this to each other, and we do this to ourselves. And I wanted to leave something behind for my kids to read one day, be like, learn from our suffering, learn from what we did wrong and what we did right. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for your gift of story and vulnerability. And in examining, I guess I'll be personal, my own life, I'm acknowledging the power of story and fiction. My question to you is, how do we as a community, knowing that stories are very personal, how do we create or increase the capacity of our community for telling stories and for vulnerability? Do you have any specific suggestions from your moving into a very small community that we could take?
Well, we live by story. I mean, that's a commonplace observation, but it's especially true in the South. I mean, I'm so blessed as a writer to have grown up in the Deep South among storytelling people. And I didn't realize what a great gift that was until I took my first job out of Baton Rouge in my 20s in Washington, D.C., and I would congregate with other Southerners. We'd be in a bar or at a party, and we'd start telling stories about back home. And these poor Yankees who are around us are from the Midwest. They'd be like, y'all are making that up. They'd say y'all, bless their hearts. But I realized, my, I guarantee you the same stuff would have happened there, where they're from, but they just didn't tell it that way. My wife comes from the Dallas suburbs, and she tells a story about once when she was younger, went over to see her mom and her aunt was working as an executive secretary, and this was maybe in the early 2000s, and the aunt was telling a story. She was whispering, and the story was about her coworker Doug, who went missing one day, and they couldn't find him, and nobody would talk about him. And then one day, the boss comes in, and he says, Doug's coming back tomorrow, and he's Donna. nobody say a thing. And my wife Julie was saying, I was sitting there listening to my aunt whisper this to my mom in her living room. I thought, my Lord, with your parents and your people, y'all be on the front porch telling as loud as you could and adding stuff to it to make it a better story. So all of that is a lot of fun, but story can build us up or tear us down. I think of the stories that I learned from my community and my family that built me up and has built my character up, but I also think about the tyranny of certain stories that have torn us down. In West Feliciana Parish, where I'm from, this is such a great tale. My Orthodox priest who moved down to be our chaplain, our pastor at our mission, was from Washington State. And after he'd been in the South for a year, I said, so what have you noticed the most about the South? What is the strongest impression? I thought, this is going to be great. He's going to praise us. He said, the way y'all hold a grudge. What do you mean? And then as we talked, I realized, you know what? He's right, because loyalty is a big thing for Southerners. And that's why my family was so mad at me. I had been disloyal to them as they saw it. And any prosperity I had achieved in the world, working at the New York Post or wherever, that was unearned. It was because I was profiting off of disloyalty. And the stories, it suddenly put the stories we had learned about loyalty when I was a kid in a different light. And I started thinking about our parish and how this is the least populated parish in Louisiana. And in the least populated quadrant of that parish, northeast West Feliciana, there are two Methodist churches, New Hope and Concord, which are ironically named. They're close to each other. Each has about 15, 20 parishioners, and they won't go to church together. They share a pastor. Pastor goes to one at 9 and the other at 11. I asked my dad, why won't they share a pastor? He said, don't you know? He said, one of them's a Spillman family church and one is a DeLee family church. And during the Civil War, a Spillman went AWOL from the Confederate Army and a DeLee turned him in, and they can't worship. 150 years later. But by God, tradition. Well, so I've gotten far afield of your question, but I think that we have to, because I saw the value of story in forming my own character and releasing me from certain kind of imprisonment and building me up in certain ways, I think we need to learn to construct our lives, to think of our lives as a narrative. How is this thing going to end? Are we living in such a way where the story that gets told about our lives when we're gone is a comedy, not a tragedy? You know, Divine Comedy is called that not because it's funny, but because it has a happy ending. And I think we have to, as I said, construct our lives so that it's a comedy and not a tragedy. Yes.
Thank you, sir, for that talk. I read the Divine Comedy in my junior year of college. I asked this question partially to vindicate myself between a former professor here and a former classmate who is now my wife. But when I was reading it, the Paradiso was my favorite, and I was the only person in class who enjoyed it so much. So I was wondering if you had a favorite, if you had one that impacted you the most, and I hope that it is the Paradiso.
You know, that it's funny you asked that. You can get from the teaching company these lectures about the Divine Comedy that are just fantastic. Hertzman, I forget the name of the other professor, they team teach this, and it was really opened up the poem for me. But they say at the very end that they have taught the Divine Comedy in a bunch of different settings. They taught it to some prisoners in a penitentiary in New York, and they loved, of course, the Inferno because it said something to them about what it's like to be imprisoned and locked into something, and they found so much solace and wisdom in that. They talked about how they taught it to a bunch of monks at a monastery, and of course they loved the Paradiso because it resonated with them. For me, I think that it's probably Purgatorio, and I think as I get older and as I grow spiritually, it probably will be Paradiso, but for me it's Purgatorio because I'm so focused on trying to overcome and to allow the grace of God to overcome within me my own tendencies toward anger and the difference in gluttony. My gosh, that is my besetting sin. We moved back to Louisiana. Within a year, I had gained 25 pounds. But there's a terrace of gluttony there, and it was so powerful, the story Dante tells on the terrace of gluttony on the mountain of Purgatorio, where he sees this group of starving people coming to him singing a hymn of joy. And he recognizes, after his eyes get adjusted to him, he recognizes one of his old friends from back in Florence. And he says, "What are you doing here? And you know, you're suffering so much." He goes, "Oh, it's nothing. This is just temporary. This is what needs to happen so I can be ready to receive the fullness of heaven." And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, we fast regularly, and that is so hard for me. We fast on Wednesdays and Fridays and during Lent and other periods of the year, but it's so important for spiritual growth to learn not to let our passions, our hungers, which for me, eating is a big thing. I'm crazy about food, to learn how to discipline those passions so they don't take us over. And clearly I need to get a lot better at it, but that's why I think purgatory means the most to me. And I'm about to go to France, by the way, they're translating my book, The Benedict Option. It's coming out in French in a couple of weeks, and they're flying me over to do publicity. Y'all can find me in the oyster bars of Paris. They're going to have to drag me out, but I'll be able to repent at leisure when I'm back home.
So poetry for me it was first rebellion when I was a teenager, and now it has become solace and rescue. So I work at Parnassus Books, which is our local.
Oh, do you?
bookstore. I do. Sometimes. I have kids. And they don't pay me much. So poetry is my thing, and our poetry section is not great. That's a nice way to say it. Because people don't buy it.
Yeah.
So anyway, just if you love poetry, go buy some. And there's lots of translations of Inferno. And I'm going to get back to the Inferno because I always get caught in the footnotes because I like history. So,
Well, no, that's so important. If you take up the Divine Comedy, and I hope you don't just stop at Inferno because you don't get most of it. You know, you're just.
fun.
Oh, Inferno is so fun, and I mean, and one of my daughter Nora, she's 10 now, and she has a really kind of a ribald sense of humor. And I was telling her, do you know in Inferno, the flatterers have to spend eternity in a ditch of sewage with poo in their mouth, and she falls over laughing. She thinks it's the funniest thing. But we've got to get this. We got. Oh, I'm sorry. You have a question.
That was just a plug. Go buy some poetry so Karen Hayes knows that people will buy it. Okay, so, you know, I love Seamus Haney, poet. So one question is, what poetry are you reading now? Another question is, so he has a poem that says, the end of art is peace. So, yes, so art, but if, you know, I'm just a reader. I'm not an artist. You know, I feel like that's obvious. Yes, all the artists need to be creating. We're in exile, we need deliverance, all that. But if, you know, as a reader, I'm becoming an activist, I think. I don't know, but I guess, since I don't read nonfiction or theology, I get bored with the language. But, you know, one of the Niebuhrs, I think, said, justice is love in the public sphere. So you know, you're about justice. I know all of us have to work this out ourselves, but do you have any advice right now for how to live that out, in the
Yeah.
public sphere?
Well, get off of social media. I'm talking to myself here too, because I find, you know, I write a blog. That's what I do for a living, and people are often surprised when they meet me in person to see the guy that writes these fiery blogs and is always talking about this awful thing, this bad thing, politically, culturally, that he's actually, you know, kind of chill. I said, look, all I really want to do is eat catfish and tell stories. But I realize that there's a problem in my writing too, in my the writing I do for public consumption, which is everything I write, that I focus too much on what's wrong and analyzing what's wrong, and I don't do enough focusing on what's right. And maybe that's one thing we can do, is, you know, take it upon ourselves to repair the world. It sounds so trite to put it that way, but it's a really hard thing to do. I was telling a story last night at my talk at the Catholic school. When I was a Catholic. I came to faith as an adult. I was not particularly churched as a child, but as an adult I came to faith, and I came to it as a Catholic. And I was really excited, an intellectual Catholic. I wanted to read theology and things like that. Somebody at my office in Baton Rouge said, "Oh, you're a Catholic. You want to be a Catholic? Well, why don't you come work with me as a volunteer at the Missionaries of Charity Soup Kitchen on Mother Teresa's people?" I said, "That sounds so Catholic. I think I'll do it." So I went down there and spent a Saturday peeling potatoes, scrubbing pots, sweeping, doing those things. And after it was over, I was like, I guess that was good, but I'm really more of an intellectual. My time is better spent reading theology and philosophy. And I never went back. Well, I became a very, very arrogant, know-it-all Catholic. This is not the Catholic Church's fault. This was my fault. I was very tribal, and I was very tribal conservative. I went to Washington, got involved in all that. And then we get to 2001, 2002, and the abuse scandal. Well, as a very faithful conservative Catholic, I said, I've got to go in there and fix this injustice. And a priest, a very wise Catholic priest, said to me, who had sacrificed his career to fight for victims, he said, "You need to understand that you are going to a place darker than you could ever imagine if you follow this." I said, "Well, I've got to do it. I mean, this isn't right, what's happening." He said, "I don't want to discourage you, but I want you to know what you're facing." He was right, and I wasn't ready for it. My faith got pulled out of me like fingernails being torn out by a torturer, and the more I learned about what was really happening. And I had Catholic friends who were just as upset as I was about what was happening, but they did not lose their faith. They kept their balance. I lost my faith. And later, when my faith was in ruins, and by the grace of God, I ended up getting my faith back and became an Orthodox Christian, but a much humbled one, I realized that all the time that I was reading all those theology books and constructing the impregnable fortress in my head that was going to protect me from any test of the faith, I should have spent at least half that time peeling potatoes, washing pots in the soup kitchen, and praying, and building up my heart, and focusing on what was right with the church instead of only on what was wrong. There was nothing wrong with fighting for justice in the church, but there's more to life than that. And as an Orthodox Christian, and as somebody who was very chastened as a conservative by the Iraq War and everything, I hope that I was humbled by my brokenness there, and I'm having to learn every single day to reach out, to run towards the good, not just away from the bad. And I don't know if that answers your question, but there are these small things we can do. St. Seraphim of Sarov, one of the great Orthodox saints of the modern period, says, "Acquire the Holy Spirit, and 1,000 around you will be saved." And that's basically the same advice that Marco the Lombard gave to the pilgrim Dante. If you want to seek to repair the world, look into your own heart first. And more than read, yes, but more than read, go do something with your hands and help people. It's my old friend Cecil Ross from Nashville. I'm so glad to see him here.
Thank you, Rod. When I first picked up your book, one of the questions I had about it was, what's he going to do about the purgatorio? I mean, he's not a Catholic anymore. The Orthodox don't believe in purgatory. And the take I got from your treatment of purgatory was that, well, asceticism, the practice of asceticism, can supply, to a certain extent, what the Catholics have in purgatory. The question I have about that is, if you're a Catholic, you believe that God knows what's coming to you in purgatory and what you are supposed to endure and what you're going to have to endure before you purge. Whereas if you're on your own, you'll be in danger of setting an ascetic regimen for yourself, and oftentimes it'll be either some bush league thing like not picking up a beer on the way home, or it'll be something grotesque like flagellation or self-mutilation or even coprophagy, things like that. What would be your advice to Christians, to non-Catholic Christians, to avoid that kind of false choice?
Right. Balance. That's that's so important, to put yourself under authority of a wise spiritual counselor like your priest or somebody else wise that you know, your pastor, so you don't lose your balance and don't become obsessed and scrupulous. The way I saw purgatory, though, as someone who doesn't have a theological category for it as a non-Catholic, you can read the Purgatorio as an example of what life on earth is like in this life after you have been redeemed, because everybody in purgatory is going to heaven. They've been granted heaven by the grace of God. They haven't earned it, but because there's a wonderful, beautiful piece early in the Purgatorio where Manfred, a man who he'd been a warrior who fell in battle, and he had not been faithful, and in his dying breath he begged God for mercy, and he said that slim reed of hope was what pulled him into heaven and out of hell. And I think that Purgatorio can be read as an example of how we should live in this life after, if one is a Christian, after one has accepted Christ or been baptized or is seeking spiritual progress. The whole journey is a journey of asceticism, but also rest. If you'll notice in the Purgatorio, they can only move up the holy mountain in the daylight, but when the sun goes down, they have to rest. And that's what the Christian life is too. It's not constant climbing. You have to climb, and then you have to rest and be restored. That's in my Benedict option book. A lot of people are reading it or hearing about it and saying, are you saying that we have to run away from the world? No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that the Christian life is one of going out into the world and then going back into the church and into spiritual life and into your community to rest and be rebuilt. So when you go back out into the world, you can be truly faithful. And I think that if you read the Purgatorio, to answer your question, if you read the Purgatorio, recognize the importance of rest and also put yourself under the authority of a good guide like Virgil or your pastor.
Very good.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you so much for that, Rod. We will have copies of Rod's book available for sale, How Dante Can Save Your Life, just outside for $25, and highly commend those to you. And of course, we also highly recommend an invitation that is on each of your chairs to join the Trinity Forum Society. There are several reasons why you should join the Trinity Forum Society, not least of which, tonight and tonight only, the first 10 people who join the society, we will give a free copy of Rod's book to. In addition to that, there are many benefits of being a society member, including receipt of our quarterly readings, where we take excerpts from great works of literature, such as the Divine Comedy, with an introduction by an author such as Rod Dreher explaining the significance, the relevance, the enduring impact of the work, and discussion questions in the back, such that it is a book club in a bag, as well as our monthly podcast interviews with thought leaders and our daily What We're Reading recommended list of reading recommendations. But perhaps most importantly, your membership helps make available other evenings like this, both in Nashville and elsewhere. And at a time when there is so much both divisiveness, distraction, and trivialization in public discourse, the opportunity to offer a space about where leaders can engage together about what matters most is not only something to be enjoyed, but increasingly necessary. And we hope that you will join us in that. I have colleagues available, such as Alyssa Abraham in the back. There'll be opportunities to join just outside the door. We also hope that you will continue to join us for future evening conversations. And normally at this point, I announce what our spring evening conversation will be. But as Brad alluded to, tonight we'll be announcing something a little bit different, which is usually, like I said, we do a regular evening conversation series, but on November 20th, we'll be doing something slightly different. Apparently, there has been great interest on the part of MBA to host David Brooks at MBA in the near future, and Brad very graciously invited us to collaborate with him on that. And so we'll be working together to bring David Brooks to the Montgomery Bell Academy on November 20th. Invitations will be sent out soon, but you are the first to know, so mark your calendars now for what is sure to be a fascinating, even spectacular discussion event. In addition, I'd like to thank once again our sponsors who helped make tonight possible. The law firm of Sims Funk, the Beasley Family Foundation, the Cheris Foundation, the Creed and Culture Fund, Jonathan Edwards Center, Gary and Susan Dean, Nathan and Laura Green, Ed and Molly Powell, John and Carol Rochford, Marilyn Smith, and Giff and Anna Thornton. And if there's any of you in here who would like to join as a sponsor, we would warmly welcome your participation. And feel free to talk with me, any of my colleagues, or with Byron Smith. As ever, it seems appropriate to end our evening with thanks, and we at the Forum are deeply grateful to our partners, Brad Joya and the Montgomery Bell Academy, as well as Jason Powell and St. Paul's Christian Academy, and would also like to help just thank the folks that make it happen. Chief among those is our trustee, also a trustee at MBA and a trustee at St. Paul's Christian Academy, Byron Smith, who is really at the very center of the Venn diagram, ground zero, if you will, in making this happen. And we are deeply grateful for his vision, his incredible energy, stamina, and acumen in making all of this happen. Would also like to thank Christian Jones from St. Paul's and Langhorne Coleman from MBA, as well as our stalwart volunteers, Tracy Wilson, Linda Hilliard, and Alex Flores, our photographer, John Morgan, our videographer, Anthony Papolo, as well as my terrific colleagues at the Trinity Forum, Alyssa Abraham in the back, Colleen O'Malley in the green, and Ashley White Brothers, who is around here somewhere. Many thanks to all of you for all that you do to make this happen. Finally, thank you again, Rod, for your very thoughtful remarks as well as your presence, and to each of you for coming, and good night.